Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Strategic Budgeting and Scenario Planning by Nonprofit Finance Fund. My name is Annie Chang. I am a director in the Los Angeles office of NFF's Advisory Services practice, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today. For those of you who aren't familiar, Nonprofit Finance Fund is a 40-year-old nonprofit organization. We are a community development financial institution that provides financial services in the forms of lending to nonprofits across the country, as well as consulting services where we partner with nonprofit leaders across the country to strengthen the financial health of their organizations. And we also lift up what we learn as an advocate for the nonprofit sector. Today, this work is in partnership with some of our network partners that are part of the Rising Together initiative. That includes the Citizens Committee for New York City, the BME, and the Hispanic Federation. These are really important partners for us as they're folks on the ground doing important work in communities. And this overall initiative is one that has a goal of positioning community-centered organizations to be able to sustain and adapt. And you can see here some of the goals of the partnership include being able to better understand financial dynamics of their current operations, being able to identify and prioritize their financial needs, as well as building capacity for financial management, resilience, and being able to make data-informed decision-making. And these are all things that we're going to explore today during our webinar session. If you're showing up for the session, just thinking about what is it that I'm showing up for, what are we going to be visiting here. This is really for leaders who are asking questions for themselves about, not really being sure about what the impact is going to be this year, given where we are with COVID and everyone's current organizational situations, and understanding there could be many ways that this year could go. How do I plan knowing that? Not sure what the impact's going to be if we're not able to raise as much as we plan through things such as maybe a virtual fundraiser or other fund development opportunities. How do I think about making data-informed decisions, such as increasing staff if I'm seeing more demand? How do I do that in a financially sustainable way? And maybe there's other questions that you're thinking about certain scenarios your organization is facing or certain decisions that you're trying to make around your budget too. This is the session where we're going to explore that more. And some of the goals for the 1 hour session is being able to use your budget strategically to be able to identify and also prepare and plan for risks and uncertainty. Enhancing the visibility we have so that we can make decision-making that is nimble and flexible and really responsive to the opportunities that are before us. And also just navigating through scenario planning. This is something we're going to offer some frameworks and practices that might be helpful as you're thinking about the scenarios your organization is facing. In starting to think about strategic budgeting, we wanted to offer some key considerations. And really that is along different phases of building a budget. As you think about strategic budgeting, it's really building a budget that can reflect your strategic goals, be able to account for what your expectations are and set those expectations for this year, being able to account for revenue restrictions or the ways that your dollars must meet compliance to be able to use them and recognize them, and also gives consideration to how we can plan for surpluses that are going to support our longer term needs. Strategic budgeting also accounts for uncertainty. A budget is a financial plan for us for the future, but we know that there's things that are going to happen to us throughout the year that we don't know about yet, or we may have some insights or thoughts about. So a strategic budget is one that accounts for that. We're going to look at that today by looking at how we can discount revenue based on the reliability and predictability of those revenue sources, as well as knowing what it takes to be able to reach your goals. Also, a strategic budget is something that helps you to know what your options are. You can identify what the fixed and variable expenses are within your budget so that you can understand if you pull certain expense levers, what is the impact going to be for your financial situation for the year. And also be clear about what the trade-offs are for certain scenarios. If you do make certain decisions on expenses, then what is that trading off for you and what you're going to be able to do or not be able to do. And lastly, a strategic budget is one that iterates. It's one that doesn't just sit on a shelf, but is really used as an operational tool where you're able to compare your budget numbers to your actual numbers regularly. So looking back and reflecting about where you are and how you did or did not meet the plan that you set out. Being able to update your projections as new information comes in. If there is new information that's going to change the rest of your year and your outlook, being able to have a budget that can be flexible and reflect those changes. And also make decisions when necessary in response to those changes. If it's going to make programmatic changes, being able to have data that informs those decisions. And also to be able to communicate with your team and your stakeholders about your decisions. A budget is something that is a communication tool. It expresses in numbers what your plans are for the year. You know, given those considerations, what are some of the things you bring into your budget? And these are things that you probably are already doing. Some of them may be new. Some of them may be ones that are things that you've used often. One of them is looking at the funding and expenses that are already committed. Likely when you start your new fiscal year, there may be some things that you already know about this year. There may be board members that you know who are already going to be providing their board donations. You may have funders who've been funding you for multiple years, so you already know a certain amount of funding is set for this year. And you also may know a lot about your expenses. Typically, organizations have more insight into their expenses, and that could mean knowing how many people you have planned to have on staff this year and what your rent costs are. But having an idea of what those commitments already are coming into your budget. Sometimes folks start with their previous year's budget as a starting place. Also looking at prior year's outcomes. What were you able to achieve against your plan? How many donors did you bring in against your plan? How many programs did you deliver? How many folks did you serve? And making all those considerations in what you're going to be able to do this year, what you want to do more of or less of. Also strategic goals. If you have a strategic plan that you and your board have developed, or if you have other strategies that you want to make sure are part of how you do your work this year, bringing those into the budgeting process. As I said, budgets are a financial communication of what your plan is, and having those strategies in mind are going to help you to put down in numbers what it's going to take to achieve those strategies. And lastly, what's really important is program and management staff input. At NFF, we really believe strongly that a budget is a really great tool for getting on the same page about your financials and getting on the same page about what it takes financially to do your work. So in as much as you're able to bring in program and management staff to the conversation, since they're all the ones on the ground that are doing the work, they will have understanding around how much it takes to do the work, as well as potential sources for revenues as well as they do that. So we always think it's a great practice to bring those folks in at certain points, even if you as the financial leader are the one owning the strategic budgeting process. So as we move into, now taking everything that should be helpful to be in place as you start the budgeting process, we think about actually looking at the budget and what comprises your budget, which is, your revenue, your expenses, and then understanding your revenue minus your expenses. Are you ending the year in a surplus or a deficit? And when we look at these portions at NFF, there's some key considerations we have in your revenue dynamics and your expense dynamics. For your revenue dynamics, we think about how does your organization generate or make money? What are those big buckets that bring in of revenue sources you have? It could be ones around earned revenue where you are doing services in exchange for a fee. It could also be sources of contributed revenue, such as foundation grants or government grants. We offer this as one framework for how to break up your revenue or how you generate your money. And then when you think about those different sources, giving consideration to what feels reliable, what are those donors that we know we can count on year in and year out, versus what is more at risk, Where do we might have funders or foundations who are at a point in rethinking their strategy and understanding whether our organization's mission fits in that strategy or not. Those may be a little bit more at risk than other sources. And how maybe does seasonality play a factor into your revenue sources? For some of the organizations I work with, they bring in a lot of their individual donor funding at the end of the year around the holiday time in December. And they expect that more of that flexible, unrestricted money is going to come in at the end of the calendar year. And that's important for them to understand. We may not fully know how we're going to end the year until we get that information and get those commitments, and trying to be able to communicate and be on the same page with your staff and with your board around why money or revenue may look low during certain times of the year and why it may look high. The same can be done around the expense dynamics. We offer this model of looking at your expenses that's broken out by functionality, which is really the big buckets of what types of expenses you have. Are they personnel expenses? Are they professional fees? The people that help us, but they are not actual employees of our organization. All of the costs that surround our occupancy, our internet costs, being virtual, if there's any Zoom platform costs, maybe you're still paying rent for a space that you're holding right now, having an idea of how much it costs us in occupancy expenses, as well as program costs, what are those direct costs for supplies or other things that it takes to do your programs, as well as the general support for your organization. These expense buckets are largely what it takes for us to do our work. And thinking about and understanding how the organization spends its money and how predictable these are. For most organizations, and staff and people resources are the biggest chunk of their expenses. And it's also the most consistent, that we generally know how many people we need every year. But there are certain organizations where there is unpredictability about that. If you are an organizing or advocacy organization and you have certain campaigns during the year where you really ramp up on staff, and then you ramp down again when those campaigns are over. It's important to know those things and be able to communicate that as it relates to how you get your work done, and also how it's brought into your budget. Also thinking about what expenses here can we be responsive with if there are changes to our budget. If we did have to know that we're going to have less revenue this year, are any of these expenses ones that we can reduce to be more in line with our revenue so we don't have as large of a deficit? What are our priorities around that? And what are the things that would be the first things to be cut? And what are the things that are the last things to be cut? And we recognize that's always a really hard discussion and even thought process to go through, because no one wants to be able to have to do less. But in moments where you may be facing certain uncertainty, it may be important to think through those things ahead of having to be in a crunch and making those decisions without a lot of time to think about them. So we know that it's a challenging exercise to think about those things, that we offer giving some thought to it ahead of time may help you in planning and be able to make decisions that are the best ones that you can when you have to make those decisions. And lastly, looking at profitability and savings. After you take your revenue and subtract out your expenses, are you ending the year with a surplus or in the positive, or are you ending the year in a deficit? If you've attended other webinars from the session, you know that nonprofits can end the year with surpluses. And if anything, NFF fully recognizes by ending the year with a surplus, you are saving up funds that are helping you in the long term. And that is a great place to be able to be in. And if you are ending the year with a deficit, it's important to understand why that is and know where are you drawing those resources from. Do you have savings from previous years to be able to have a deficit this year? Are there other reasons that you're going to be experiencing a deficit, and being able to understand your financial story around that? When you're looking at the budget of revenue, the budget items of revenue, expenses, and surplus deficit, and you're doing a budgeting process or a planning process, There's some things that we would offer would be helpful as you're planning. One of them is really articulating your assumptions. Sometimes organizations will get to the middle of the year and they'll see the number that they have for individual donors, and they may not remember, why did I say I was going to raise $1,000? But if you have it in your notes, the goal is for 10 people to contribute $100, then it's a good reminder of what were the assumptions behind that number and how did you think you were going to get to that number? Are we on track for that or not? Is there more we have to do around that? I would say that for both the revenue side as well as the expense side, it's helpful to remember where you were and thinking when you did this plan. And also identifying your risks or potential swings in revenue. There are opportunities that you may know of things that may not come through, and being able to understand where that could be, and writing that down, taking a note around that, you can see, and plan around if that actually happens. And also identify what you do and do not have control over, which is some of what I just discussed around looking for where you have levers you can pull, and what are things that are within your control versus things that you're waiting for others on, such as funders, to make a decision for you. Typically, your expenses are you have more control over those than you do over your revenues. As we think about looking at this model, a question that often comes up is, how do we account for that uncertainty in our revenue sources? Like a lot of leaders I work with is, yeah, we can put an idea and a plan around our expenses, but revenues is just so much harder. We submit applications or proposals. We don't know if the funder is going to say yes or no. We host fundraisers. We hope we make our fundraising goal, but we're never actually sure. How do I plan for a number that feels like it's something we can actually raise? And so we wanted to offer a couple of practices that may or may not work. And in doing these various webinars, we've had some leaders who embrace them as an idea they want to try. We have some leaders where I feel like this feels a little bit too risky. So we just wanted to share some other ideas that might be interesting for you to think about in financial planning. One practice that's been helpful for leaders we work with along this is making a list of all of the confirmed and potential revenue sources you have. For some leaders, this may be in your brain. For some leaders, you may just have an ongoing list of the folks you want to apply for, you want to research, or maybe you already have their contact and you want to make an ask of. So we would say having that whole list, and then within that list, assessing across each of them, what is the likelihood of receiving funding from them? And how much might they fund? And then using this information to make a data-informed projection of potential revenue. So I'm going to walk through the second steps of how we've seen this go in practice. So for assessing the likelihood of your revenue, these are some of the questions that leaders we've seen and we've worked with have often asked, is to understand how much potential do you have to get a grant or get funding from a funder? How aligned are we with what the funder funds? Is what the funder is funding what we do, and do we fit into that, such as the issue area they're addressing, the geography that they fund within, the target demographics of people served, is that similar? Or anything else that gives you a sense of the programs that you do are aligned with what the funder has a strategic goal around. Also, what types of things have they funded in the past? There are some funders who only fund capital projects or like fixed assets and buildings. And if you're not in need of that, or you don't own your building, then that might not be well aligned with you. There might not be a lot of potential, but there's other funders who fund against those target areas or issue areas, and then they provide general operating support. And you're an organization who's in need of every organization's in need of general operating support. Maybe the things that they fund are in line with what you need. And what do we know about the amounts they have granted to others in the past? This is something where if the funder is one that in your group of peer nonprofits you've heard that they typically give $5,000 to $15,000, you have a sense of how much you might expect from them if you did get in a situation where you could submit a proposal. Some funders, maybe they do multi-year funding. So you think, oh, maybe I have a chance to get $50,000 over 3 years. Having some information about what they funded in the past may give you an indication, and you may see some of that. A lot of funders are posting what their grants have been over the past year also for transparency. So that may help you to give some understanding of potential. And also, what is their relationship with us? If it's a cold call, it may feel like less potential because there is no like warm introduction to them. They may not have a reason to reply to your email, but it may feel a little warmer if someone on your board has a strong relationship with them and is also on your board. The potential may feel higher because of that. Or maybe they found us because they've been doing research and they called us and they asked for a meeting to talk more about what we do. And or even more strongly that they asked us for a proposal for what we do, then that feels like stronger potential because they are actually actively seeking us out, which feels much more potential than if we were cold calling a foundation that we don't have any, that they don't know us at all, and that we don't know if they're interested in us at all. So all of these things, and how do you take that into a number for your revenue? And this is one way to do that. And this is the way where I said some folks, think this is helpful, and other folks are considering whether this is going to work for them or not. But an example of this is breaking up each of your revenue potential sources by grade or by probability. So A is at 100%. That is like, we know that they've already committed to us. So that could be that they already wrote to us and so we were approved for a grant, or that they already have a grant contract with us. B is really, the proposal is submitted. It's feeling very probable because we've gotten this grant every other year. So we can put it not at 100% yet because we haven't gotten the grant, but we'll put it at 90% or at a B level. C is kind of like moderate. It's more than 50%. Like, we have somewhat of a good feeling about this because they reached out to us, they had a call with us, and we've now submitted this proposal. So we do feel like there's a sense we could get this. So, maybe putting that at a 60% likelihood. And then this goes below to 25%, which is you're feeling less likely about it. And 10% is really speculative. We don't have any relationship with them, but they fund in Los Angeles and we operate in Los Angeles. So, there might be a very small chance that we can get a grant there. So taking this probability, we can actually apply the percentages to the estimated amount of the grant to see what we would come up with in a total revenue a total revenue number. And this kind of just accounts for what we think might happen and that discounting of the actual dollars. So in this example, we have 5 different sources. We have estimates that the leader has made over how much they think the grant could be for. And clearly for this first one from the government agency, they maybe applied for 25,000, they got 25,000. So it's at 100%. We already know we're getting this money. So we're going to count all of it in our revenue for this year. This next one is the reliable foundation, where it's been very reliable in the past. They funded us every year. We're very certain. They've always funded us 20,000, but we don't have a contract yet for it. So let's count 90% of this as part of our revenue source because there's a 10% chance it might not happen. And then there's the sometimes major donor who has been off and on with us. So we feel more than 60%, and they've typically given $1,000. So let's count that as 60% of 1,000. And then the new corporation, where we're in this learning process with them, they typically have been giving around 5,000, and we're going to count as 25% chance it's going to happen. And then lastly, maybe there's a couple different donors that total up at a $5,000 potential of individual donors, and we're researching and reaching out to them, but we're really not sure. It's our first time doing individual donors. So we're going to put it at very less likely at 10%. So with a discount methodology, you would multiply each of these amounts by the percentage of likelihood. And this is the totals for that. And so if you were to think that all of these were going to come true and you planned for all of them, you would be at 56,000 total. If you applied a discount based on how likely you think it's going to happen, you would be at 45,350. Another way that you could do this is doing a cutoff methodology, where you say, like, we really don't want to count anything in our revenue this year unless we feel fairly certain about it. And so we want to only include things that are at 60% or above. And so if you totaled that at the cutoff methodology would end up at 46,000, which is actually really close to the probability percentages by weighting each of the amounts, which came out to 45,350, right? It's about a $700 difference. And so what we're offering here is by placing some likelihood on your revenue sources, it's going to probably give you a number that might hopefully be closer to what actually happens during the year than if you were just to say yes to every single thing that was on your list. And there's also folks who are very conservative and they only put in revenue that is at 100%. And you're only willing to plan for expenses for things you have against, which we would offer just to monitor each year how many things come in throughout the year. This is really accounting for the fact that things happen throughout the year, or we may have opportunities for funding that when we start our budget year aren't 100% secured. So that was one consideration for revenue. And for thinking about forecasting expenses, we want to name some considerations around different types of expenses, because expenses are often more directly within our control than revenue. We can make the decision on whether we spend the expenses or not. And as opposed to waiting for the funder and trying to estimate what their decision will be around it. So when you're building a budget, it's important to keep these kind of expenses in mind. This is, one of them that you all have probably thought a lot about is direct versus indirect. And those direct expenses being the ones that are directly tied to your program, things that are only happening because you are running this program, versus indirect expenses, which are expenses that are shared to support the whole organization. What's important to note is that you still need the indirect expenses to do your direct program work. So how much of the indirect expense are you attributing to each program? Different organizations will use different allocation methods. Maybe it's by percentage of headcount for the program. It could be percentage of revenue that the program contributes. Some government contracts put a max on how much indirect expenses you can actually cover with your contract too, or your grant. Another consideration is fixed versus variable expenses. With fixed expenses, they do not change if we do more or less. And that could be your rent up to a certain point. There are organizations, once you just get really start to outsize yourself in the space, then you're going to need another space. But for the most part, for a certain level of programming, your mortgage is fixed or your rent is fixed. There's other things that change directly based on how much work you do. And those are called variable expenses. And that could be office supplies. It could be back when we were in person, paper, copy that are going to go up if you're doing more programming, and they're going to do less if you do more programming. It's important to think about this as you add or take away programs, because you should be thinking about what are some of the things that are general expenses that we're going to need more of because we're just doing more. And what are some of those things, just because we stop the program, it doesn't mean it's going to go away. We're still going to have to pay this full amount. Understanding how changing your expenses and making different changes can impact your mission is really important, because you don't want to remove an expense that's going to have a cost for your whole organization, like something that you didn't know was super important to the whole organization, but you decided to remove that. So it's important as a leader to think ahead about what are the impacts of your expenses on your mission. Strategic budgeting helps you to quantify your risks and helps you in decision making. By having some of these practices that we talked about, you're going to be able to know more about what happened and why that happened, understanding what your plan was and whether it happened according to plan or not. And if it didn't, what were the things that took us off plan? And it helps to budget more accurately for the next year too, and to plan also. And then it helps real-time decision making so that you can be able to know that these are the things that I'm deciding to do, and be confident that if you decide to make that decision to maybe reduce an expense or add an expense, what it means for the organization and how much you can, financial ability you have to do that. So one of the things that we want to consider for scenario planning, which is additive to strategic budgeting, because as you're budgeting, you're probably thinking, well, there's certain different ways the year can go, right? Like we could have a really great year where things happen as expected. We can have a year where there's things that could be the worst case of what is expected. And right now, in the moment of COVID, you know, as I'm recording this, it's August of 2021. There is still uncertainty over the Delta variant, over reopening. Different offices and organizations are starting to reopen to the public again, but there's also considerations for the risks in that. And so there are leaders who are thinking about, do I reopen or do I wait till later? And so thinking about the financial implications of that, we're offering a little bit of a matrix to explore your different scenarios and to financially look at what the impact would be of those scenarios. So you have an understanding of if you make this decision, what could be the outcomes of that financially. And we offer that having this information helps you to make a decision, right? It's not gonna make the decision for you, but it's gonna give you more information. So in this example here for ABC organization, what they're considering is, do we do a full return in person in September, which would be very a fast-paced reopening. If they're thinking about this in like August as how quickly they could reopen. And also knowing that there could be a slower pace reopening too. We may just be remote for the rest of 2021 and go back to in-person in 2022. You know, those are two things that we're thinking about. Another thing we're thinking about is the financial impact. Is it going to be a low financial impact where we'll pretty much do fine as we expect this year, or is there going to be a high financial impact where we're going to see funding decline in different areas? So out of that, you know, the example here we have, we're going to model two different scenarios. One of them is maybe a little bit on the less great scenario, and then one that is a better situation. Sorry, this is the better situation of if we're able to have a phased return throughout the year and then do a full return in person in September with very minimal effects on financially on us for 2021 and us really seeing good financial returns in 2022. And then on the less ideal example or scenario, we have a slower pace reopening where the organization stays fully remote in 2021 and doesn't return in person until January 2022. And they actually will see some funding decline because of that in this year. So these are the two that we're going to choose. Part of what we offer in scenario planning is to give you permission to just choose and make your best bet on what the scenarios are, the ones that are most likely for yourself, because there's a lot of different things you can model. But actually just selecting some that are the most likely and going down the line of those assumptions is going to help to kind of think through what it can mean for the organization. So we've selected these two scenarios, and we are looking now at what the budget implications are for the scenarios. So here we see that this is the budget for fiscal year 2021. It runs from January 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2021. And we have the budget broken out as we modeled earlier, with revenue in one section, with earned income from county and state contracts, contributed income from individual donors, foundation grants, and their net assets released, which is their restricted revenue from previous years that are being released and made available to them, for a total revenue line, and then expenses by the different functional expenses we talked about earlier, and then their total surplus or deficit at the end of the year. So you can see their baseline budget of just staying current with their operations, of how they're operating right now with limited reopening. They have an assumption of experiencing about 358,000 in revenue, 407,000 in expenses, and ending the year with a slight deficit, about a little more than 10% deficit of 49,000. In scenario A, where remember we said that the programs would fully reopen in September and there would be growing service demand. So we would see some more revenue because of that service demand. We see that there's increased in earned income Perhaps it's because we are able to reopen and see more folks. And so we're earning more of those fees that we have for serving folks from our contracts. And then there's also a rapid response funding that's made available. So there is an increase of, sorry, this amount is not right, but an increase of $5,000. And so we have a little slight increase in foundation grants, and that puts us at a slight increase of total revenue to $433,000. And we also see here that there's some increase in staffing costs, maybe because we are now fully reopened in September, some slight increase in supply costs for the services we're doing, as well as additional rental space for the services, because maybe we're doing a program in a different location and we have a slight increase in rent. So here, even though there is increased expenses, there's also increased revenue coming in with this scenario. So in scenario A, the organization is actually experiencing an 8,600 surplus as opposed to the baseline deficit. And in scenario B, we see the situation where programs go fully remote in 2021, and they're really not going to be in person again until 2022, and there's a moderate decline in service demand. So we see here with the county and state contracts, there will be less service delivery, so there's a slight decline in those earned income revenues, and we see a total revenue here of $325,000, which is slightly less than the baseline. And then we also see slight reduces in expenses also because we're doing less. So reduction in supply costs to $32,000. And because volunteers are not going to be available since we are still not fully remote, we're not fully in person yet, we're going to reduce all of those volunteer expenses. And so there are no volunteer expenses. So we see total expenses at $384,000, which in scenario B actually shows a deficit of $58,400, which is slightly worse than the baseline. And I think understanding here that this is what could be the worst situation is helpful for leadership to understand, could we withstand a deficit of this much? And at what point would we need to make a change in the expenses if we can't withstand this deficit, meaning we don't have enough in savings to be able to continue to pay this and end our year on this way. And also important for the financial storytelling of how does this year impact us, and be able to be on the same page with that with our board. And so this is how scenario planning could be helpful for organizations to see what those potential fears and risks you have could make financial implications and what it means to the bottom line for the year. That tool is available on NFF's website, and you can pull down a scenario planning tool from there to do on your own if it's something that's helpful. And there's also a little webinar that goes through that tool specifically too, if you wanted that. The implications of scenario planning is really giving you strategic implications. It's being able to have data-driven strategic conversations, really thinking about what is it we want to do, what is the direction we would want to go if certain things happened, the way that we have the risk that it might happen, and also understand the implications of your decisions as you move forward. Helps you to identify options, to make contingency plans if you do start to move towards a scenario where you'll have to make changes. It's often hard to make those changes at the last minute if having not thought through it ahead of time. And being able to articulate the triggers, perhaps, at what point does it start to look like we're in scenario B? And do we need to make some cuts in expenses? And I share all of these things knowing that it's an incredibly hard position to be in as a leader, to be responsible of these things. And we know that you all are deeply on the ground doing the work and not often having time to do this kind of strategic thinking. We hope the things we're offering today are places that you could plug in and potentially incorporate. It might support you in your work and alleviate some of the things that are uncertain for you as a leader right now. This is the scenario planning tool that is specific, that walks you through the actual Excel tool that we have on our NFF page that you can access. And this is one webinar out of a series of webinars. The next webinar that's coming up is around understanding your mission and money matrix that Alex Antonelli, my colleague, will be leading. And you may be able to, you may be doing that in order, and so you may be listening to that next. And thank you so much for tuning into this webinar, and we really hope that it was helpful and offered some considerations for you as you lead your organization right now. We appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you and have a great day.